Today we leave the Torres Straits and we begin our journey home again. We're not going directly back to Atherton, we're going to go down the western coast of the Cape and then cross from west to east down near Karumba somewhere. Our first destination is the mining town of Weipa. It's only about 130 miles direct and it's not going to take us more than about an hour and a half to get there, so we won't be too long in the air. Heidi and I have never been to Weipa, so for us it'll be totally new. Martin has lived and worked in Weipa way back in the 1970s and 80s when it was being first set up, and Rob has worked there in the last 10 or 20 years, so he's been more recently, but it'll all be pretty new for all of us. Our initial track will take us across Horn Island, then across the little chain of islands to the mainland, and then we'll turn south and we'll just follow the coast, pretty much staying on the coast the whole way to Weipa. At the northern end of the Cape, there are a few small Indigenous communities centred around Bamaga, and from there's nothing until we get almost to Weipa, where there's the small community of Mapoon. Although it's spectacular flying and the scenery is fantastic, it's not a place you'd like to have a problem and have to put down. There's no services, no communication, and on the ground you'd have to deal with snakes and crocodiles, and in the water, crocodiles and sharks. So all in all, it's a great place to see from the air. After a bit less than an hour's flying, we reach the tiny Indigenous community of Mapoon. Mapoon's only about 40 nautical miles north of Weipa. Weipa is a mining town, and it was originally completely owned by the company who set it all up. I think these days it's still generally owned by Rio Tinto, but it's now a functioning town with all the usual facilities like schools, shopping centres and hotels and restaurants. The product they mine here is bauxite, which is the ore from which aluminium is extracted. Bauxite naturally forms small brown-red spheres about 5 to 10 millimeters in diameter, and here they mine it by what's called strip mining. They don't have to dig huge pits or mine shafts, they just simply scrape large areas of topsoil off. It's only down to about a metre or two, and then the bauxite's exposed. So from the air, there's these large bare areas, and everything is predominantly red. Rob had some friends in Weipa, and he'd organised for us to borrow a van. But while we waited for the van to arrive, he found an alternative mode of transport. Our initial plan after leaving the airport was to find our motel. And that being done, we headed off on some sightseeing. Around the township was just pretty typical of a western mining town. Then we headed out of town to the north across a big single-lane bridge and ended up at the gates of one of the mining areas. We couldn't go any further than that, so we turned around and we went back and came to a turn-off where we went down to the aptly named Red Beach. After we'd finished at Red Beach, we went back up to the main road and then headed back into town. We had a look on Google Maps and we found another beach on the southern side of Weipa at an industrial area called Evans Landing. And we thought that might be a good place to go and have a look at. And the added advantage was that we wanted to be somewhere to have a good look at the sunset across the water. And there was some beach and also some wharves and boat ramps where we thought we might be able to get a good view of the sunset. The following morning, we had a booked tour of the mining operations. It turned out to be very popular, and it was a good thing we booked early because all their buses were full. It was quite an interesting tour. We never got off the buses though, but it was quite impressive. The thing that impressed me the most was the scale of everything there. The mining operation was huge. The trucks and the trailers and the trains were huge.
That's 40 tonnes above that head of that loader. Now roll that bucket forward, mate. Load that truck.
Once we'd finished the mine tour, we got back in the van and headed off to the airport. Unfortunately, Heidi had to go back to work in Cairns the following day, so she caught a Qantas Link -8, and after she was safely on board and departed, Martin, Rob and I headed off to Karumba. We'd actually debated whether or not to go down to Karumba at all, because the reason that we went there was a number of people in the original group had never been to Karumba. However, as it happened, all those people had dropped out along the way, and Martin, Rob and I had been to Karumba many times and didn't really need to go again. At this point, we could have done a direct trip back from Weipa to Atherton, but at that time of the afternoon, with the forecasted headwinds, we would have been pushing last light, and we already had the booking at Karumba anyway. We could have gone with a stopover at a new location like Cohen or Laura, but actually I felt a bit guilty because when I originally booked the Karumba accommodation,
We had 8 people in the group and needed 4 rooms. And the owners of the place had been very accommodating and went to quite a lot of trouble to fit us in. And then over the course of the last week or two, I'd been gradually whittling down the booking, room by room, as people dropped out. And I felt that we had to at least fulfill part of our booking. Over the years, we've done many of these trips to lots of small places, and we've often booked out a place, and I've been acutely aware that suddenly cancelling can cause significant loss to the accommodation. And generally, the people at these places have been so good and so helpful that we've tried really hard not to stuff them around unless it's absolutely necessary. The leg from Weipa to Karumba is just under 300 nautical miles, and it's even more sparsely populated than the leg from Horn Island to Weipa. There's only 2 small indigenous communities along the way, Arakoon and Pomperour, and neither of which of those have any facilities, and the communities are just not set up for visitors. There's no accommodation or anything. In fact, you can only go there if you have permission and some approved reason to land there. Other than those, and a couple of basic bush strips on cattle stations, there's no sign of human habitation for nearly 3 hours of flying. The scenery, however, remains just as spectacular and wild. Toward the southern end of the Cape, the scenery changes from the green, scrubby vegetation on red sandhills to low tidal mudflats. The scenery's classic of the southern Gulf of Carpentaria, and I've never seen any scenery similar anywhere else in Australia. Karumba, in the southeast corner of the Gulf of Carpentaria, on the other hand, is a really good stopping point. It has great all-weather strip with Bowser fuel. It's a bit of a funny setup in that the actual township of Karumba is 6 kilometres up the Norman River, while the airstrip and its associated motels and pub are right at the mouth of the river in what's locally known as the Point. I've been to the Point at least 6 or 8 times, but I've never actually been into Karumba Township itself. There's a walking track about 6 kilometres long into town. There's a taxi in Karumba, but they don't answer their phone calls very much, and the times we've tried to get a taxi in to go and have a look in town, we've never been able to get them to answer the phone. However, the Point has pretty much everything that you need, particularly for just an overnight stop, and it's quite famous locally for being a great place to have dinner at the Sunset Pub, sit on the grass under the beech almond trees and watch the sunset, and the sunsets there are spectacular. The downside is that Karumba is a very popular destination, particularly amongst grey nomads and fishermen. It's known throughout North Queensland for its barramundi fishing and for crabbing, and it hosts a couple of barramundi fishing competitions, one in about April at the end of the wet season, and the other one in about October. And this means that there are times when the town and all its accommodation are booked out. So if you're planning on flying there, you really do need to plan ahead. We tried once to get an unplanned short notice accommodation there, and we couldn't. We had to stay at Normanton, which is only about 15 minutes flying up the river, but it's not as nice as being at the Point and watching the sunset. So for us, Karumba has become a traditional last night stopover. The final leg home was forecast to be fine pretty much all the way home, but there was a forecast for headwinds later in the morning, so we planned on an early getaway. The trade-off about that, though, is that we would spend a significant part of the 2.5-hour trip flying into the rising sun, and that would make visibility a bit annoying. But with that in mind, we got up in the dark, made the short walk across to the aircraft, and got ourselves ready to depart at first light. And it wasn't too long, and another flying trip came to an end.